Okay, so um, I'd like to have two parts to this lecture. One would be a brief review of Lawrence Kohlberg's model of moral reasoning, and I just included some brief notes uh, on the different levels. Um, no matter what exam I took, Kohlberg, there was usually one question on Kohlberg, whether it was the comps or the NCE or uh, even my lifespan course. Um, so we can't get around that. He's one of the original theorists on moral learning theory, moral developmental theory. Um, but the second part of this video, um, I'd like to kind of talk about my own thoughts on moral development. Um, so we're going to begin with a pretty famous dilemma. Maybe you've heard it before, um, and you can write your answer to it uh, in the discussion post and maybe why that would be your answer. Here's the dilemma. It's called the Heinz dilemma. It has nothing to do with ketchup. Heinz had a wife who was on her deathbed because of being afflicted by a certain cancer. Special radium that was recently discovered by a druggist of the same town was touted that it could save her. So Heinz ordered the drug. The drug cost $200 to be manufactured, but the druggist quoted the price at $2,000. Heinz could not afford the drug and pleaded to the druggist to sell it for less because his wife was on her deathbed. But the druggist refused. In desperation, after the shop was closed, Heinz stole the drug. What would your reaction if you were in this same situation? Would it matter if the price was different? Would it matter, um, what would make a difference? Um, okay, so you can discuss that. So Kohlberg had three primary uh, levels of morality. Pre-conventional is the first one, obedience and punishment. That's stage one of this level. Um, in this stage, rules are looked upon as being absolute and fixed and are followed with the objective of avoiding punishments. Now, one thing that I usually discuss uh, in various theories is that, if we have reinforcement and punishment uh, in like operant conditioning, um, usually people do try to avoid punishment, but when the threat of punishment goes away, then they no longer abide by those rules. So the punishment is only an enforcer of that rule while the punishment is possible. It doesn't ingrain anything innately in the individual. Um, People think it does, especially if it is physical punishment, but it doesn't. Um, Individualism and exchange is stage two of level one. In this stage, the rules are given secondary importance. What is focused on instead is the way in which the individual needs are satisfied. Level two, conventional morality. Stage three, um, interpersonal relationships. Conforming to societal rules becomes important. Decisions are based with the view of how they affect others. Stage four, maintaining social order society as a concept becomes clearer. Um, they learn to be a part of the same by following societal rules and laws and to do the duties that are expected of them. Level 3, post-conventional morality. Stage 5, social contract and individual rights. The differing values, beliefs, and opinions of the other members of society come to the fore, maintaining of law with differing personalities can pose to be a challenge. Stage 6, universal principles. People follow their individual sets of rules and values, even though they clash with societal rules and principles. Now, all of these things sound extremely structured to me. Now, in your book, you're also going to read about various ages that morality develops based upon different theories. Um, I I don't think it's so cut and dry. I also think it is much more encompassing. So let me give you an example. Um, a lot of theories talk about um, children uh, learning empathy or at a certain age. Um, so I don't, or learning morality or concepts of morality at a certain age. I don't think we can place this morality uh, learning into ages or stages um, quite so simply. Here's the reason, because um, I think, and this is just my thoughts, um, I think if we look at all of the various theories and uh, begin to incorporate these concepts, um, things really begin, moral development really begins with trust versus mistrust, Erickson, and combining that with attachment theory, with Bowlby. Um, so think about it this way. If we don't develop trust and attachment, we don't allow ourselves to become vulnerable or to trust. And without that, we cannot love fully. We cannot experience empathy. Without empathy, there is usually no guilt. Um, so those are the internal frameworks that bring about morality at a basic level. Um, we don't want to harm other people because we can put ourselves in their position. Uh, and we might care about other people. Um, so the very first stages occur before a child can really communicate verbally. We know physically their reactions by hugging or feeling secure around caregivers and others and showing love. And children can show empathy without language as well. They can express emotion in relation, like if I was sad or if their mother was sad or crying about something, maybe they experienced a loss, uh, my children would come up and hug us. So, um, they experience this basic empathy at a much earlier age, but it's rooted in trust and love and attachment and those bonds. And then those bonds move on to other relationships. and children do begin to experience rules, and but it's also important that these rules are not just because I said so. You know, it's important to explain why rules are in place so that they understand and they want to follow the rules. Um, and even if they don't want to, they understand why. And at least a rule is in place to keep them safe or because we care about them. Um, so, there is a logical grounding in rules. It's not just a blind following of rules. I've always had trouble with authority um, and rules. If I didn't agree with them, I'd want I'd want to understand, and if I didn't agree with them, well, I got into trouble quite a bit. So, but I did understand my parents' rules because they were grounded in logic. There's a reason for them, or it's because they cared about our welfare. Um, so all of this helps the child in the formation of a morality that is also connected with, on one side, emotions, love, bonding, attachment, trust, vulnerability, things like that. On the other side, we're adding on uh, this logical understanding of why we have rules and what the possible consequences would be of breaking them. And I'm not talking about punishment. If we break a rule, something bad might result. Like if we break a rule having to do with a traffic rule or regulation, there might be an accident. Somebody might get hurt. If a child runs in a street when they're not supposed to, they could get hurt. So there are logical consequences and possibilities that children learn to predict before taking action. So the next stage becomes a little more abstract, and I'm using the word stage, maybe the next learning process in my mind. Um, and it's kind of when we ask, well, what if? What would the consequence be? What if there wasn't a rule or we didn't know what was going to happen? And this is when we really begin to incorporate predictability of consequences and uh, not only having empathy with other people when they are experiencing an emotion um, like pain or suffering, uh, but we can predict empathy. So, predictive empathy as well. How would somebody feel if I said or did something? What would the predictable consequence be? Um, and this takes also an incorporation of impulse control, of thought before action, of predictability, of abstract thought. Um, so all of this comes with a gradual maturation process. The next thing I want to bring up um, is a little less tangible, but I think it affects everybody. Everybody has some belief system as well that they grow up with. So you could be a Christian, a Muslim, a Druid, a pagan. You could be anything that holds a belief system. And each of those religions or spirituality concepts also holds values. So it might not be, up until this point, I'm talking about kind of empathy and ethical choices. Um, but there's also kind of these values that people are brought up with as well. And hopefully they are altruistic. even if people do not have a spiritual belief system, they still have a belief system. So agnosticism is more of a universal belief system, but atheism, the belief in nothing after death or no higher power, is also a belief system. The belief in science uh, and evolution, Big Bang, and all that, that's a belief system. They just don't have that spiritual component to them. But people find comfort in those, and uh, there are laws of nature and science and everything else. Um, and there are consequences for actions, and there are ethical choices for the good of humanity, the earth, etc. So, whatever the belief system is, spiritual or not, we're brought up with that. We carry that with us, and we have to somehow incorporate those belief systems and the morality that is attached to those belief systems, more of a value judgment than an ethical judgment, although people believe it's an ethical judgment. Um, and sometimes it's both an ethical and a value judgment uh, combined. But somehow people have to combine those things, and they don't always go together exactly well. And then we have to make some choices. Um, but if we're rooted in those basic things like empathy and things like that, um, one other thing is people begin, whether they read philosophy or not, but people begin to think about bigger questions, um, like, you know, um, all of these ethical problems that uh, philosophers bring up, you know, um, like the example of the medicine, and I can think of a dozen others, but, they're ethical choices. There's really not a specific uh, answer to that because there's no one answer that is correct. They're usually paradoxical in some way. Um, I think that a lot of times our environment affects our um, our willingness to become vulnerable, which affects our ability to trust, which puts up emotional barriers, which become boundaries, and ultimately that affects our ethical judgment, believe it or not. Um, so there are all kinds of influences, environmental influences. Uh, if we have been abused or experienced trauma, um, that affects trust and empathy, and um, all kinds of things affect us in different ways. Um, but I just kind of wanted to give a basic idea of what I was thinking about uh, the cognitive learning development and morality, and I'd like to hear your responses. I won't be offended if you disagree with me. In fact, uh, I like having a discussion about this kind of stuff. Have you ever thought about this on your own? Come up with your own ideas? I'd love to hear them.